Hello world, you're back with me, Marky P, and this time it's not for a question video about the Beatles that I really don't know the answer to. It's a sort of Q&A video really about sort of your favourites kind of thing. I think the last time I did one was as a response to one of Ben Simpson's videos about the good and bad things about vinyl. This time it's in response to a video that came up as a recommended video after I uploaded the last video, and it's from Funnyface26. He asked 15 questions about the Beatles and obviously replied to them with his opinion. I don't know Funnyface26 at all, but I thought that's a good idea. I'll do one of those videos and I'll answer the same questions, except that he had 15 questions, I've got 14 questions. The reason why is because one of the questions that he asked was, do you prefer Sgt. Pepper or Their Satanic Majesty's Request by the Rolling Stones? I don't know their Satanic Majesty's Request, and even if I decided, well, perhaps I'll play it, it doesn't give it the kind of justice. I've known Sgt. Pepper since I were knee high to a grasshopper, since about 1981 or something like that. You know, that was the first time I heard Sgt. Pepper as a 13-year-old. And so to compare it with something that I hardly know at all just wouldn't be fair. So if you know both of those albums and you know them like the back of your hand, and that you know each album as well as the other, then feel free. If you want to answer that question in the comments, then feel free. Do you prefer Their Satanic Majesty's Request or Sgt. Pepper? I don't know. Okay. The final question, for a very similar reason, I've slightly reworded it. The original final question was including artists like Badfinger on the Apple label. Well, I don't know really who Badfinger are. I've never really listened to them, and therefore I'm not in a position to judge. So I've slightly reworded that question. Okay, but other than that, these are all Funnyface26's questions. Or question, no, actually they were questions that were asked of him by somebody else. He's replied, and now I'm replying. Okay, but as I say, I don't know Funnyface26, but if you ever come across this video, then thumbs up, and thank you for providing the idea for me for this video. Okay, so away we go then. Oh, quickly, before we do anything, I have to apologise. Last time there was an issue with the sound. I'm not sure why. I was using the Blue Yeti microphone. I've used the Blue Yeti microphone for years and years and had no problems with it whatsoever. Even used it for vocals on things, and at the moment it just seems to be making a horrible crackly noise. Whether or not that's to do with a bug in Apple's latest operating system, or whether or not it's to do with, I have a feeling that it's to do with a lead. I know that I've got a lead that is sort of hanging on by the threads of its teeth, and it's been hanging on by the threads of its teeth for a very long time and not really had too many problems with it, but at the moment it's awful. So the first take of this video, which I recorded yesterday, just was even worse than the video I recorded the other Monday, when it was, you know, it was still crackly behind, but this was even worse. There was no way I could put it up and expect you to sort of cope with 40 minutes of that sound. It's horrible. Okay, so I'm using the internal microphone here, which again, it's not as good as the Blue Yeti when it's behaving itself, but it's better than the Blue Yeti when it's not behaving itself. And another thing that I also did relating to the last video, I made some comments about Magical Mystery Tour. Now, hopefully most of you kind of got the context within the fact that I made those comments. Sometimes I can be very blunt with my opinions. I don't apologise for being blunt with my opinions, but I did qualify those opinions. I said the word relatively when I was talking about the Magical Mystery Tour film and the album. Okay, the Beatles' 1967 content, going all the way back to Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane through to Sgt. Pepper and All You Need Is Love, was of such high quality. Then there was a hiatus because Brian Epstein died. There was a huge amount of pressure on them. They not only had to cope with their own personal grief with that, but they also then had to cope with a media that would be down their throat saying, oh gosh, Brian Epstein's dead, now what's going to happen to the Beatles? Are they going to carry on? Blah, 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 blah. And they made this decision to carry on. I can't really say that Magical Mystery Tour, the film, was anything but rushed, because it would have been, even in those days. It would, you just don't make a film in a few weeks and then put it out. And they didn't have, you know, the professional directorship at Help and A Hard Day's Night. Both of those, you know, had proper scripts written for them. They had you know, proper directors. You know, all the editing and stuff was done by sort of professional things. This was a home movie, Magical Mystery Tour. It was a home movie. It was shown in black and white on Boxing Day, not Christmas Day. I did make a mistake there. It was shown on Boxing Day, Christmas 1967, and it flubbed, basically. It was also shown in black and white on Boxing Day, Christmas 1967, which probably wasn't the best decision. It was shown a week later in stereo, in colour, but by then the damage had been done. Okay, it works slightly better in colour than black and white, but as I say, it was not a professionally made film. Yes, they have fun making it, whatever. So if you think that, you know, the quality of the Beatles stuff prior to Magical Mystery Tour was right up there, all I'm saying is that relatively they'd slipped a bit. It didn't take them long to sort of come back up to scratch. You know, the following year we'd had, you know, Hey Jude and Lady Madonna and the White Album, and you can't be expected under that huge amount of pressure to always perform. My opinion on Magical Mystery Tour is that yes, it is pleasant. The film is pleasant. It's not particularly good. The music is better than the film, obviously. And if I'd written The Fool on the Hill and I Am the Walrus, I would be a multimillionaire by now, and I would also be a genius. But by Beatles standards, it wasn't quite up to scratch. Okay, enough said. All right, to these questions then. And I'll try and be quicker now. Red or blue albums? Now, for me, my favourite kind of Beatles era was post Rubber Soul onwards, i.e. late 65 onwards, up until 69. I don't particularly get on well with Let It Be. It just makes me feel too sad. You know, the end of the Beatles. And, you know, for the same reason that I don't particularly get on well with The Visitors, because it was obviously the end of ABBA. Abbey Road, although it really was the end of the Beatles, because Let It Be was recorded first. Let It Be was recorded in a whole bunch of acrimony while they're all freezing cold, and in this awful studios that Magic Alex had supposedly invented, saying, you know, you can have as many tracks as you like. Why bother with 8-track when you can have as many tracks as you like, kind of thing. That was John's friend Magic Alex, whatever, and it was just a nightmare. Although Abbey Road was the last album that they recorded, it was recorded in under better circumstances, you know, relationship-wise and everything. You know, they just made the decision to get on with it. They got George Martin back on board again. They'd kind of ditched George Martin for Let It Be. That aside, whatever, the Blue Album, by rights, ought to be my favourite out of those. But I don't think the track listing works as well with the Blue Album, just because you start out with a single, Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, and then suddenly we get great big chunks of Sgt. Pepper, which, if you're going to want to listen to great big chunks of Sgt. Pepper, put Sgt. Pepper on. You know, it sounds out of place and mismatched to have great big chunks of that album and then sort of follow it up with, you know, a little bit from Magical Mystery Tour and whatever. It's wrong. It's wrong. In the same way that when you put Back in the USSR on, you expect it to be followed by Dear Prudence. You don't get that feeling with the Blue Album, I'm afraid. It is wrong. On the contrary, the Red Album was built mainly around Beatles singles, and a few album tracks, but all of those singles and album tracks can stand on their own. You haven't got like a great big chunk of Revolver, for example, that just seems totally out of place with another great big chunk of Rubber Soul, for example. Yeah, yes, you've got songs from Rubber Soul and Revolver on the Red album, but it just makes more sense. And for that reason alone, I'm going to say that I prefer the Red album. It's a much better track listing. It's been put together much more thoughtfully. The Blue album doesn't really work quite as well from that point of view. Okay, question 2, US, UK. The albums in the US were by and large released by Capitol Records. Capitol Records were greedy. Capitol Records would withhold tracks from the album before and put them on the next album, and then they would withhold tracks from that album and put them on the album after that. And it wasn't until Sgt. Pepper that the American market got what we were getting in the UK. Okay, because the American market were greedy, they also wanted songs that were not in their finished state. So, for example, there were songs on Revolver that the Americans wanted early, and because they'd only had mono mixes in the UK by that time, because they weren't ready to release them, they then only got fake stereo mixes for the US. So at the time, in the 60s, there were songs on Revolver, US version, that the Americans had never heard in stereo before, because the Beatles and George Martin, whatever, they weren't ready to release them properly. They, and they weren't even like, necessarily the same take or the same mix as the UK version. So I would say most definitely the UK, but I will qualify that by saying that there are millions of people who grew up with the American albums in America, and those albums to them are very special. Okay, I haven't heard any of the American pressings. Maybe that's to my shame. Maybe I ought to try and put that right at some point in the future. I think they released in the same way that they sort of remastered the UK albums. I think they remastered the US albums and put them in a box set. Well, if they did, then perhaps I ought to try and get one of those. But yeah, maybe I ought to. But at the same time, I think philosophy-wise, Capitol Records were just doing their very, very best to make as much money out of things as possible. They even, you see, the Beatles never really liked to release albums that had previously released singles on before. Yes, there were a few of them. Hard Day's Night and Help and Please Please Me are the obvious ones that stick out. But by and large, the Americans also released a lot more singles that came off albums. And, again, it's greed factor, Capitol Records being greedy, I think, and I don't agree with it, and so on that basis alone, I will say UK. All right. Right, Please Please Me or With the Beatles? For me, the answer is definitely With the Beatles. I love Please Please Me. It's a brilliant album. It's got some great songs on it, but I also think that with that album, which was obviously the first Beatles album to be released, I think EMI were doing, or Parlophone as it were doing their very best to kind of say, you are Northerners, we're from London, you're Northerners, you're mere scraps of things, and we know what's best for your career. Therefore, we do not like the drumming on Love Me Do, so we will provide this session musician called Andy White, who will also play on the B-side, P.S. I Love You. And that's what happened, basically. Ringo recorded drums for Love Me Do, but obviously EMI decided that for whatever reason, and I just think it was sheer bloody mindedness, that they were going to sort of have a different musician playing on that record. And, again, I don't think that the song would have bombed if they'd released Ringo's version. Ringo's version did get released kind of by accident The first few copies were Ringo's version. And how do you tell the difference? On Andy White's drumming version, Ringo was given a tambourine to play. And so if you hear a tambourine on Love Me Do, it's Ringo being replaced by a session musician. If you hear it without a tambourine, it's Ringo playing the drums. But P.S. I Love You was only recorded once, as it were, and it included Ringo on percussion and Andy White on drums, which, yeah, just not good, really, not good. And, you know, to cap it all off, they also tried, as I say, to bully the Beatles into recording How Do You Do It, which became a hit for Jerry and the Pacemakers. But it's like, you know, we know what's best for you. When you can write songs as good as this, then you can. Well, John said, right, well, look, we've got this Please Please Me song. And they played it. And George Martin, give him credit, said, speed it up a little bit and see what it sounds like. Yeah, we'll go with that. That's a brilliant song. And it was #1. And, you know, they obviously didn't look back after that. But, you know, so, you know, those issues aside, Please Please Me was recorded in one day, which was a mammoth feat, an absolute feat of genius and hard work for all of those concerned. With the Beatles, though, they took a lot more time with it. They sorted out the track listing and put a lot more thought into that. And, you know, the recording is much more professional, and I just think works better as an album. So for me, it's With the Beatles all the way. And With the Beatles also sounds just a huge amount of fun, you know, all the way from It Won't Be Long with John's punning, It Won't Be Long Till I Belong to You, etc. You know, and it's just great. It's just really, really good fun. Question 4, White Album or Abbey Road? I will definitely say Abbey Road. I did release a Beatles albums ranking, and I think for every album ranking that I've ever done of the Beatles, whether it's, you know, to YouTube or to friends or whatever, I've always put Abbey Road at the top of my list. I love it as an album. It is fantastic and such a beautiful recording, and really rewards a decent hi-fi system as well. So yes, Abbey Road all the way, although again, there's nothing wrong with the White Album. The most underrated album, I will go for this one, The Beatles for Sale. Again, this is a bit like Magical Mystery Tour. By the end of 1964, the Beatles were absolutely knackered. They had a contract to fulfill, which I think was 2 albums a year plus 6 singles. And, you know, they were sort of thinking, well, you know, we're going to be sort of playing it by the skin of our teeth, getting this album out by the end of the year. But they did. And they look a bit knackered on there. But the performances on here, yes, A Hard Day's Night was all John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And then they've gone back now to including some covers on there. But, you know, the Beatles' own songs show a huge amount of development. I'm a Loser by John Lennon is John Lennon kind of, you know, expressing his inner thoughts, you know. I Don't Want to Spoil the Party. Again, it's John Lennon, you know, again exploring the darker side of his personality. And it's not Moon, June, I Love You, Love Me Too kind of thing. It is, you know, this is, you know, a proper development of lyrics. People split hairs about Mr. Moonlight. I love Mr. Moonlight. The Beatles were incredibly camp. It has to be said. They were incredibly camp. And that sort of cringeworthy organ solo on there and everything, it's just fun. It makes you laugh. It's good. It's, you know, and, you know, I just think that this album, it is so solid. It's such a good album, but it kind of gets tarred with the brush of, oh, the Beatles were tired kind of thing. And, you know, in terms of the actual sales figures of it, they were relatively low compared to the others. So, favourite album opener. Now, there's a bizarre reason for this, but I'm going to say it's Taxman, because Taxman started out Revolver, and it's just a mark of how far they'd come. By June 1966, when Revolver appeared on the market, the Beatles, I don't think they had finished touring as such, but they were certainly at the brink of finishing touring. They did, their last tour was in 1966. I don't know the dates or anything like that, but and I don't know which happened first. But I certainly know that Revolver was really, the dawn of a new Beatles era. And how did that start? In pretty much the same way that their whole career started. A one, a two, a 1, 2, 3, 4. I saw her standing there. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then Taxman by George Harrison. And it is such a it's a hark back, but it's also this is us. We're still the Beatles, but we're different. And that counting is actually a false counting. There's somebody behind who is actually counting them in. You can hear them in the background. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dun, 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 dun. So yeah, but it's just for that. Just for that, it's an absolute masterstroke of genius, I think, on the Beatles' part there. Just, the heart back, we're the Beatles, but also we're moving forward. And I will also, no, I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, right. Yeah, number 8, my favourite cover song. It's on with the Beatles. It's called The Devil in Her Heart. It was originally done by an American group called the Donnays, an American girl group. It was sung as The Devil in His Heart, obviously. When the Beatles turn it round, it suddenly lends it a huge air of campness, which I absolutely I just think is hilarious. It's really good fun. It's not RuPaul's Drag Race, but it is, it's going on for that way, and I just think it's brilliant. So yeah, that's my favourite cover song. Number 9. Favourite song that no one talks about much. For me, that's The Word on Rubber Soul. It preempted The Summer of Love by 2 years. John, in particular, was getting very frustrated by the fact that Brian Epstein discouraged them from giving their political opinions. They did do things sort of on the sly. They refused to play segregated stadiums in America. They refused to play South Africa. They took a picture for the Yesterday and Today cover, which was released in America, of them sort of dressed up as butchers with dismembered carcasses and blood pouring everywhere. The Americans decided that that was not appropriate because, yes, it was John's response to Vietnam, but the Americans wouldn't have that. We've got to have our clean cut boys kind of thing. When John did try to express his opinions, he expressed his opinions on religion in an interview with, I think it was a lady called Maureen Cleave, and that a little snippet got printed in an American newspaper, which resulted in the Deep South organising mass burnings of Beatles records by, it has to be said, radio stations that never played Beatles records in the first place because they were sort of country music stations, never played Beatles records, but told everyone that they had to burn the records, whatever. So things were getting quite ugly. But at the beginning of that, we've got this song, The Word. If it hadn't been followed by a lot of those sort of tiny little actions by the Beatles, it would have just been a very nice, oh, shouldn't we all be nice and kind to one another sort of thing. But it actually preempted the whole Summer of Love scene, the whole of the sort of Woodstocks and festivals like that and what have you. And it sort of was the dawn of this era, So yes, The Word, it's an extremely important song in the Beatles canon and gets overlooked a lot. Right, number 10, favourite George song. All of George's stuff I think is brilliant, even Don't Bother Me. George, as a talent, was hugely underrated in the Beatles, and he had to wait, like, you know, for every 10 John and Paul songs, then he might get to try one of his out, and he found that very frustrating. But on Sergeant Pepper, his sort of crowning glory was this number called Within You Without You, which I think is just absolutely amazing. It is my favourite George song on the Beatles. uh, when he was part of the Beatles. It's not my favourite George song altogether, but it certainly goes uh, up there, you know. But as I would say, you know, all of the Revolver stuff, all of his stuff on Help and Rubber Soul, brilliant. And you know, I think that Within Without You is a pretty sort of crowning achievement. And also, you know, let's not forget that although George did find it frustrating recording with the Beatles, I still think that, you know, there were modicums of respect that were shown. For instance, you know, an album has to have a strong opening on side one, strong closing on side one, strong opening on side two, and strong closing on side two. And, you know, to put him as the opener on side two of Sergeant Pepper is a crowning glory. To put him as side one opener on Revolver is a crowning glory as well. But yeah, I'm definitely going to go for Within You Without You. It's just a superb number. Okay. If I had one album, that would be the Mono Masters here, because, you know, as I've, you know, I spoke about the Red and Blue albums, and, you know, particularly with the Blue album, I thought that the track listing was a bit dodgy, not particularly well thought out. This is basically all of the singles that didn't appear on albums. It's all of the B-sides that didn't appear on albums. It's all of the EP tracks that didn't appear on albums. Plus, it also has the Yellow Submarine songs that were recorded in mono that were not included on other albums. As we know, the Yellow Submarine album was a compilation with a couple of new tracks, and it's the new tracks on here. So Hey Bulldog, Only a Northern Song, All Together Now, and It's All Too Much, i.e. basically side 5 of this album. So this album here is like a cross section of the whole of the Beatles' career, but, you know, put together in a much more coherent way. So if I really were forced to live with one Beatles album, then that's what it would be. And I kind of pulled that out of my head. Because, you know, the actual, you know, Beatles albums that were released during their time together, it would be really, really hard to choose one of those. So at least this one, you know, you're getting a flavour of each. Sergeant Pepper versus Pet Sounds. Now, for the same reason that I don't really know their Satanic Majesty's request, I do have a copy of Pet Sounds. I have played it a lot. I do like it a lot. I don't think that it's as coherent an album as Sergeant Pepper. It's certainly pretty darn good. It's important to note, though, that the Beatles and the Beach Boys were competing with one another from across the Atlantic. So when the Beatles released Revolver, the Beach Boys put out Pet Sounds. When the Beach Boys put out Pet Sounds, the Beatles thought, blimey, and then came up with Sergeant Pepper. So, you know, there was this, you know, real sort of competition, healthy rivalry and competition between them. So, you know, it wouldn't necessarily be a case of saying, you know, I'm kind of dumping the Beach Boys because I prefer the Beatles or whatever. It isn't a case of that at all. You know, they're equally good, and yeah. But But yeah, it's Sergeant Pepper for me. Number 13. A Beatles book that you would recommend as a first choice for someone who's never read anything about the Beatles. Now, that depends on what you want to read about the Beatles. Number one, what I would say is avoid anything that claims to have been written by people who knew the Beatles at the time. So, for example, there's a chap called Peter Brown. Peter Brown is mentioned in the Ballad of John and Yoko, by the way. He wrote a book about, you know, his time with the Beatles, as it were. A lot of these people, though, you know, that they sneezed while the Beatles were on the same train as them, you know, or something like that, you know. Or my mum once cleaned up for, you know, Paul McCartney, whatever kind of thing, you know. And you tend to find that with these particular kind of biographies, they tend to dig the dirt on the particular member of the Beatles that they weren't mates with. So, for example, if you were mates with Paul McCartney, then you're going to make a great big meal, perhaps more of a meal that needs to be made of perhaps, you know, John Lennon's drug abuse. We'll forget that Paul also took drugs, but, you know, we'll make a big meal of John Lennon's drug abuse, and you know, and just things like that, you know. And, you know, it will vilify Yoko, for example, you know, because Paul's our mate kind of thing, you know. And so just beware. Just beware that if it's written by someone that claims to have the authority of knowing them at the time, they're usually dishing up dirt and tittle tattle. So if you want a relatively non-biased biography of the Beatles, there's a chap called Hunter Davies who wrote the official biography of the Beatles, and that's been revised and updated many times. I think it was first released in '67. It was literally that old. But in the '80s, a guy called Philip Norman wrote a book called Shout, The True Story of the Beatles. It's been criticised, but it does take a very objective view of, you know, not only the biographies, not only the albums and the Beatles and whatever, but also the kind of affairs that were going on at the time. So, for example, any kind of you know, financial deals that fell flat on their face, you'll learn all about them in this. And yeah, it's a pretty objective thing. And the 1982 edition that I used to have, I'm not sure if I've still got it, but but I used to have it, and it had an interview with Yoko at the back of it, which was basically, it was after John's death, and she was quite pleased with the way that Philip Norman had written about John Lennon in the first edition of the book. And so she said, well, would you like to come over and, you know, see where we were living and have a chat, whatever. And that interview was then published in the sort of the epilogue of the next edition. So it's a particularly good book, and I think, you know, you could say, yes, you know, on it's quite authoritative as well. If you're interested in more than just the bio, if you're more interested in their music, there's a book called Tell Me Why. Now, this was released in the mid-80s. Again, I don't know if it's still around. I've got a copy of it, but essentially it analyses from a musical standpoint the songs on their albums and selected solo efforts as well. So that's a good read as well. And, you know, finally, if you want to, you know, get a cross section of what was being written about the Beatles at the time, then there's a book called The Lennon Companion, which has all kinds of interviews in it, including the interview that I talked about where John Lennon said, "We're more popular than Jesus." Again, there's some good music analysis articles in there as well, including a particularly good one about Strawberry Fields. So yeah, it's either Shout, Tell Me Why, or The Lennon Companion. I would say those are the ones to sort of really look out for. Before I leave the question on the books, there is a book called A Hard Day's Right. It's by a gentleman called Steve Turner. And in it, he talks about each song lyric by lyric. And my issue with that is that I don't want to diss the man entirely out of court, but there are lots and lots of times where he misquotes lyrics. And so therefore, if he's misquoting basic things like Beatles lyrics, then how right is he about everything else? So that's another one that I would just steer clear of. Okay, just go for the three that I've suggested. Okay, so the final question, which is one that, as I say, I've just slightly reworded. Whose first solo album? And this is going to be a bit like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Is it A, Sentimental Journey by Ringo Starr? Is it B, Plastic Ono Band by John Lennon? Is it C, McCartney by Paul McCartney, obviously? Or is it D, All Things Must Pass? Now, I have to say that, right out of the bat, I've never heard Sentimental Journey. The closest I've heard to a Ringo Starr studio solo album is an album called Blast from Your Past, which includes some songs from Sentimental Journey on there. And, again, I heard it when I was about 13 or 14, and I did play it over and over again. It was released as a sort of budget album in the 80s on the MFP label, Music for Pleasure, which is a sort of budget subsidiary of EMI. And yes, I bought it at that time, and yeah, I liked it. It was fine, whatever. But it's been so long since I've heard any of Ringo's solo stuff. So, right. With Paul McCartney, the McCartney album, I think it took Paul McCartney a relatively long time to get his career kick-started. He found, yes, he married Linda in 1969. The Beatles split up and everything was going absolutely pear-shaped by 1970. It depressed him an awful lot. They went off on a retreat up to Scotland, found a house. Paul had bought the house, I think, before then. But he showed the house to Linda, and Linda said, "Oh, this is great, whatever." And they did the house up. Paul got very depressed, obviously, about the state of the Beatles affairs and everything, and what am I going to do for the rest of my career? And Linda encouraged him, yes, well, you can write songs, whatever. So he wrote songs up in Scotland, whatever, but they weren't fabulous. Let's put it that way. It took him a long time to a good 2 years to kind of get into his swing with his solo career and with Wings. I think the first Wings album was an album called Wildlife. It was one that I borrowed from the library, and I never ever bought it, and I don't think I would even listen to it on Apple Music now. I just found it just really not a good album at all. But yeah, by the time that we're getting to 1973, what have we got? The absolute, holy grail of solo Beatles stuff. We've got Band on the Run. We've got Venus and Mars. We've got Wings at the Speed of Sound. And then we've got this fantastic live album called Wings Over America, when Paul was doing sellout shows to, hundreds of thousand people holding stadiums across the US and, across the globe, whatever. And he, really was in his swing and getting his sort of life together. But as I say, his first albums, let me say they're tentative. And again, I don't want to kind of, poo-poo him too much. If I'd written McCartney or Wildlife, then again, I would be heralded as a genius and whatever, and I would be a multimillionaire and stuff. And I haven't written Wildlife or McCartney. So, yeah. Right, so that leaves us with Plastic Ono Band and All Things Must Pass, both of which were absolutely stunning efforts by John and George, respectively. The Plastic Ono Band, yes, it's kind of cut down in sound. You haven't got the sort of massive layers of Strawberry Fields or Lucy in the Sky or anything like that. But, you know, you haven't even got the massive layers on things like I Want You, She's So Heavy. It really is, you know, sparse. And it's John, sort of all these years later, coming to terms with the loss of his mother and, again, the loss of the Beatles. And one thing that I would say is that it includes a song called God. And this song, God, is basically about John giving up the Beatles. You know, God is a concept by which we measure our pain. I'll say it again. God is a concept by which we measure our pain. Now, this is not, you know, some sort of man with a beard in the sky or whatever. This is saying that all of these things that he had done, and there's this great list. I don't believe in Dylan. I don't believe in Zimmerman. I don't believe in yoga. I don't believe in this. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in the next thing. All these things that he kind of filled his mind with to try and sort of block the fact that his mother was dead. Boom, you know, and to block the fact that he deserved his happiness. You know, I don't believe in Beatles. And everything stops. And then it starts again. I was the walrus, but now I'm John. I just believe in me, Yoko and me. You know, and so my dear friends, we'll just carry on. And it really is, it's just catharsis. It's just putting, you know, out of his mind. It does not saying these things are no good. It's just sort of saying if you put them in the place of your own well-being and your own personal happiness, then at some point you are going to be left with, I don't believe in Beatles, boom, gap, silence, and then you kind of have to come back to yourself, you know. And you know, stunning, clever piece of work. But if you sort of consider all four of the Beatles going their separate ways in 1970, George was the one who had the most trendy friends. Delaney and Bonnie, Jackie Lomax, Billy Preston, Leon Russell, and even Bob Dylan. All of these people, these were the trendy guys that he was hanging around with, and it rubbed off onto his songwriting. He also had this great kind of catalogue from sort of previous years where he just hadn't been allowed to record half of his stuff with the Beatles. The Beatles did even do a demo of All Things Must Pass, but it kind of never got past the kind of the censors at the time. So, you know, George, yeah, okay, I'll do it myself. And he released this absolutely phenomenal triple album, which I just think, you know, it's brilliant. All Things Must Pass. It's an absolutely fantastic album, and for me, it would be my favourite out of all of those albums. Okay, right, so with that, I shall end it. I've got a fair bit of editing to do here. I've made a few fluffs and boo-boos and stuff like that, but hopefully you've enjoyed this video, found it informative. Thank you again, Funnyface26, for me coming across your video and wanting to kind of copy it and what have you. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.